Hello, hello. Let's cut right to the chase today. We're in part two of the workbook. We've now moved beyond lesson 220, and we're in part two where we're going for direct experience. Okay, that's it. End video. Yeah, no, stick around. Direct experience. So what we're going for now is direct experience, meaning that we're going to practice sitting still, sitting quietly and allowing. Allowing what? Allowing God to take the final step himself, as A Course in Miracles outlines it. In other words, we're simply dropping all of our drama and allowing truth to be what it is. This is what is meant by God taking the final step himself. In spiritual practice here in the world, we're forgiving, we're doing whatever we do, whatever you're doing for your spiritual practice to prepare, in a sense, to prepare for this final step. A Course in Miracles puts it in terms of perception and knowledge. Knowledge is of God. It simply is, right? And perception is the world of duality, the world of the ego, the world of bodies. And as we've just spent significant time on, we know now that we're not a body. So the question then becomes, have you experienced that you're not a body? If you haven't, no problem, right? No problem. That's all right. That's perfectly okay. If you have, then, well, you'll know from experience what that is, what that feels like. And whether you've had this direct experience or not, the remaining lessons here in the workbook, and we'll start on lesson 221 in the next video. The remaining lessons are all about experience. You've heard me say before in this series of videos that spirituality is all about experience. It is. It's important to read books, right? It's important to pick up A Course in Miracles if this is what you're following and read it. I mean, read the instructions, read what Jesus has to say. Yeah, it's important. And it is also important to have enough of a grasp on the material and the meaning of it so that it inspires you to continue to sit down and practice. You don't have to understand all of this intellectually. The intellectual mind, as we experience, maybe you've experienced this already, and if you haven't, well, you will. The intellectual mind is not capable of understanding truth. The intellectual mind thinks in terms of subject and object and words and symbols, which are not, as we've seen, the things that they represent. The phrase, the term, human being is simply a collection of sounds that we've all gotten together, and in this language that we've gotten together and called English, in this series of sounds that we've gotten together and called a language, right? They're labels, they're terms that we put on things. We've agreed that the term human being, that collection of sounds, represents this. Quite simply. So we use language as a tool. What we're encouraged to do in A Course in Miracles is give it over to the Holy Spirit. If you have other guides, give it over to your guides. Yeah. This is beautiful because it's getting out of our own way. It's leaving our false sense of self, the ego, to the side. It's admitting that we don't know what to do, that we don't understand a particular situation, that we're not the experts here. That is absolutely huge and monumental on the spiritual path. It removes significant power from the ego right there to simply state that you don't know what something is for. Remember back to the very beginning couple of lessons in the workbook. I do not know what this nose is for. I do not know what these paintings are for, right? That may have seemed like a completely bizarre and abstract exercise at the time. And it often does when you start out. You can easily find yourself wondering, well, why the hell am I doing this? What's the point? The point is, it's a way of saying, I don't have all the answers here. It's taking power from the ego, placing it where it belongs, which is your self, capital S, the Holy Spirit, God, Spirit, Source, name your term, right? Again, those are all just terms, aren't they? Yeah. What we're going for here is direct experience. So we have come through the review period that's 20 lessons long, where the central theme is, I am not a body, I am free, for I am still as God created me. And as you go forward here from this point in practicing these ideas, I invite you to recall that passage as many times as you can and must, as many times as you think of it, as it occurs to you. It's beautifully resonant. And I can tell you from my first experience going through the workbook several years ago, that stuck so much that it comes to me all of the time. Now, you may not have this experience, or you may. We went through it 20 times in a row for a reason. Does that seem like overkill? I mean, sometimes people come up to me and say, well, why do we have to do this over and over? It's just, don't we get it? We answer our own questions sometimes, do we not? All right. So part 2, the introduction to part 2 states quite simply in the very first sentence, words will mean little now. It's about direct experience. Now, what's going to follow in the workbook are a series of questions and answers, and then workbook exercises, daily lessons that follow along that theme. But you'll notice now that we're not being asked, per se, to scan the room as we were earlier and say, this mask does not mean anything. These light switches do not mean anything. This rug behind me does not mean anything. You'll remember those exercises, but we're at a different place now. And my hope for you is that you agree and you feel, and you just know that you are indeed in a different place now, and can simply take a day's idea and sit and await the presence of God, which is always there. We're actually getting out of our own way and allowing truth to be as it is. Now, we've been practicing this. There are, of course, many, many ways in world spirituality to do this, and they all go by different names in different languages. That happens because there are many doors. This is something that one of my teachers from this lifetime, Lama Michael Conklin, whom I've talked about here on these lives and videos, something that he says that I think is really a great way of looking at it. It's a good response to a question: why are there so many spiritual traditions in the world? I mean, why, right? If there's just truth, why are there so many different apparent manifestations of it? And he looks at it, and I invite you to look at it this way: there are many doors. As we've gotten wrapped up in identification with the ego, developed what we call a personality, developed and cultivated territory, personal territory, and labels, gone and done our thing in the world, run amok, pretty much, right? And as we've done all of that, we've had the experience that truth always calls to us, but we hear it. Each of us hears it differently. In other words, some spiritual traditions will resonate with you very deeply, and some will not. And the same is the case with me. And I've practiced, you might say, experimented, which is not a bad word, really. In this case, I've learned from and practiced many of them in this lifetime. And you may have too. And maybe you're doing that right now, because we can certainly do that, can't we? No problem there. There's so much out there. But we find that there are certain practices and traditions that speak to us. We follow those. They're all like doors that open into the same courtyard, so to speak. They're doors that open into the same house. Truth simply is, and there are many approaches to it. So let us be very glad of that. Every spiritual tradition is valid in that it helps people allow truth to be what it is. It leads them to identification with what is rather than the ego, which is not. So as we go forward from here on out in the workbook, practice looks a little bit differently, and it will most likely to you feel a little bit differently. We really need only call on God and await his presence. That's all we have to do, really, is sit quietly and even call the name of God. That is practice in and of itself. And because there is a process that we're on, there will be some questions and answers from here on out. What this is going to look like is, yes, we still have a need for words sometimes. And maybe you're at a point where you feel like you don't need them, and that's fine. If you do, and even if you don't feel like you do, and you're going through this workbook diligently anyway, let these periods of time enhance your understanding. So I'm talking about one in particular, and that is, it appears on page 401 of the workbook for students. It's Immediately after the introduction to part 2 of the workbook, then there is an Arabic numeral 1. What is forgiveness? And that's on page 401 of the second combined edition. You may have a different edition, so I invite you to just look for it in the edition that you have, or if it's online. There is a segment of a few paragraphs that talks about forgiveness. And then there will be several workbook lessons, which I'll cover here in separate videos, that bear on that subject of forgiveness. So we've talked a lot about it. We're talking about it again, and go figure, right? Forgiveness is a miracle. It is a miracle. Remember, a miracle here in A Course in Miracles is any shift in thought, any shift in action, any shift in deed from the ego to God, from fear to love. Any choice of love is, in fact, a miracle. Forgiveness is among those. What are we doing? We're overlooking what our brother or sister did not do. They never did do. Remember, there's no opposite. There is no other. And when there appears to be an other in the world, everything that we do is either an expression of love or it's a call for love. I find this very helpful, and I hope that you may find this helpful. It's a tool to lean on when you're feeling like this is hard to do and you don't want to forgive somebody for something. You want to call them every name in the book, starting with son of a bitch, and get worse from there. It's a really helpful tool, because what's the appropriate response to a call for love? Exactly. It's to extend love, and forgiveness is doing that. Now, this commentary makes a very interesting point, and that is about allowing, which is really the theme of this video and spiritual practice in general. We sit quietly and forgive. There's really nothing that we need to do. This is a way of getting out of our own way, of leaving, if just for a moment, our rational intellectual mind, which, by the way, is not who we are, and leaving it and placing the power and the authority that exist always in the present moment in the hands of God, in the hands of the voice for God. In other words, the Holy Spirit, your guide, your guides. We simply, as we forgive, we're welcoming truth as it is. There is no separation of any kind. There is no one out there and no past. So the person or people you're forgiving did not do anything. They can't have. Everything that appears out there, so to speak, is going on in here. It's an outward manifestation, a projection, like an image on a movie screen. It's all indicative of what's going on within your mind. The appropriate response is always forgiveness, and we are, by so doing, welcoming truth exactly as it is. So in the next few days here, as we go through the workbook, there will be several ideas that we'll talk about, and they will bear on this question: what is forgiveness? What we're going for, remember back to the very beginning of this video, what we're going for is direct experience. So in order to have direct experience, we must, of course, practice. What is forgiveness? And let's practice allowing the truth to be as it is, and let us welcome it.